Hi, I'm Scott Barry Kaufman from the Imagination Institute. At the Imagination Institute, we're dedicated to making progress on the growth, improvement, and measurement of imagination across all sectors of society. Toward that aim, we've been hosting a series of imagination retreats. These retreats consist of discussions with some of the world's most imaginative thinkers across a wide range of fields, from psychology to comedy to physics to spirituality, among others. We've had a lot of exciting discussions about how imagination operates within each field and how it can help young people develop imagination. We've also been discussing the importance of imagination in society more generally. What you're about to watch is edited footage of one of these imagination retreats. In addition, all the videos and reports of all the retreats will be available on our website at imagination-institute.org.
We often try to get the largest audience possible as opposed to finding just the right audience at the right time.
I think that's, in terms of the orchestral challenges, how to make it relevant today is a big issue. And one of the ways to do that is to create projects that imaginatively speak to parts of the audience. I also think there's a big move, certainly in opera, to create this whole chamber world of opera, smaller pieces. There's all these pieces with 6 instruments, 8 instruments. Beth Morrison is doing this a lot in New York very successfully. And but it's happening all over the country. The guerrilla opera, playing these operas that are happening in smaller venues. And everyone's trying to reimagine how to do this in this new world, and in a world where, I'm a classical musician. I was raised playing clarinet and singing and so forth. Still, for me, 50% of what I was doing when I was a kid was listening to pop music, and for most people, it's who don't wind up being in our profession, it's 99%. So how to reach that crowd, and those people are smart, folks who frequently who just don't connect to this repertoire.
And I think that there's a much more awareness and a sensitivity to the fact that as artists, we need to actually have conversations with different groups of people that we would hope to be an audience, and to try to find out something about them and about their needs and about maybe what they actually want, or what could be helpful to them, or what they might be interested in, before we just walk in and do something for them that we presume that they would enjoy, and that they would enjoy it or find a connection to it just because they had never heard it before. So it's a different approach, and it's one that I find incredibly, as I say, from my work with the homeless situation, incredibly humbling and incredibly thought-provoking, and being able to create in a different way and to collaborate, playing music with people who have certainly not the level of technical skills that I have, but it showed me really right up front that music is something that comes from the heart, and that everybody has something. It's just like your quote that, who was it that said music is man, or man?
Stapleton.
Okay.
Man is music.
That's it.
Yeah.
And that just is a lovely 3-word phrase that if we could always just remember that, we can find better connections to other people, and we can use the technical skills that we have to help reach these people and to help unleash their creativity and their imagination. And that's what I've found to just be so amazing with this Broad Street Ministry, when you have people from all different backgrounds. And of course, many of them are psychotic. You don't know what they're thinking or what they're imagining. And when we start off one of the sessions, it's pick an instrument. They pick these percussion instruments, and the Philadelphia Orchestra people that are there have their regular instruments, and then there's a guitar and a pianist there as well. And the very first thing is, how do you feel today? And it's just very interesting. But some of these people I've worked with for months, never heard them utter a word. But I know many things about them from the way they've played their instrument, and in response to someone else playing an instrument, and hearing their response to that. have this conversation, get to know these people, get to know these groups of people, and use our skills to design things that make a connection to them so that we can have an intersection of what we know and what could be helpful to them. That's, to me, is so exciting.
That's wonderful. I love the question, what are you feeling? Because it seems to be, if you could distill it down to one question, that is sort of the essence of what music is.
Yes.
One of the notions that's recurred in our time together has been the notion of being a natural. I wonder how this resonates.
I'm sure that all of us have incredibly different opinions. I mean, I think that one of Isaac Stern's sayings was one of God's greatest gifts is the ability to communicate a musical phrase. And I'm sure I'm paraphrasing that a little bit, but I remember him saying that even in front of our orchestra when he was performing as a soloist when I was in school. And I think with something like that in mind, I think a lot of us would feel like the ability to communicate this musical idea that we have is something that is natural. It's something that we're born with, and trying to break it down and teach it is not impossible. But if the ability to comprehend it internally isn't there, can we do it? One of the things that fascinates me about music in itself, and I think it has to do with things other than music as well, but what is innate and what is learned, and I think that's a huge. We can come at it from both directions. When we look at, for instance, the conductors who were considering as potential Curtis students, they take a huge battery of exams and interviews before they ever step foot in front of the orchestra. And sometimes the ones who do so poorly on the exams, or poorly with our standards, get onto the podium and are incredibly natural. So I have this fight with myself all the time as to, is it really necessary to know in order to feel? And that's something that I constantly battle with, and depending on the day, come down on either side of that line.
So do you see certain components, in young composers, young performers that come, that they're not naturals, but you find that your program at Curtis or your teaching program, like you see just dramatic changes in 4 years that they're here, even though they're not naturals at it?
I know for myself that my very first lesson, I walked in, and Glenn Dotson, who was then the principal trombonist of the Philadelphia Orchestra, walks in, he sits down, and the first thing he says to me is, "I'm not here to make you a great trombonist. You can already play the instrument. So my job is to make you a great musician." And to me, trombone and music were like, it's the same thing. And he's like, no, they're not. They're not the same thing. You just chose that instrument as your medium to communicate the music that is inside of you, or that you're thinking about, or that you want someone to understand. Which to me, that was, I think, the first time anybody had ever said, it really doesn't matter about the instrument. Like, forget the instrument. Don't need it. And now, that being said, he never would have accepted someone who had really poor technique, because then you can't communicate the ideas that you want to be able to share. So it goes hand in hand.
Do you think passion takes you a long way? If someone is really passionate, do you think they can grow and change in their work?
I think so. I mean, I think that, again, going back to, if I'm teaching trombone, I'm thinking there is no music making before technical clarity, that there is a baseline that everybody has to achieve to be able to communicate whatever musical ideas they have. And if someone is, for whatever reason, not able to have that vocabulary of technique to be able to communicate, then we never truly understand what their ideas are.
I respectfully disagree with Paul. I think that talent can be developed, and that philosophy is deeply rooted in my own experience through the Suzuki method, which says character first, ability second. And aside from being the mother tongue, like how do we all learn how to speak? We learn through imitating our parents or the people who are around us, through positive encouragement, through repetition and imitation of the people around us. If we learn how to create a beautiful tone when we're very young, well, we also have beautiful hearts or beautiful characters. So the idea of character and talent development are deeply connected, through a particular approach of music education, certainly not the only valid one at all. I'm not suggesting that, but I do think that there's a long-term development possibility in the hands of the capable teacher. Of course, a method can only be as good as the teacher teaching it, right? And in that way, I think there's a long-term entry point into the music sphere, the humanity of music. As Casal said, I'm a human being first, a musician second, a cellist third. And I do identify with that very much because I think our music is innate to us as human beings, but how we communicate that and connect with that is a long-term growth, talent, character, ability, development through life.
What I find fascinating whenever the conversation about being a natural comes into play is that it tends to turn into this discussion about technique or artistry in a weird way. And I think that's kind of what's been happening a little bit now. And I've always found it fascinating because I think the thing that's most important is the balance between the two. Though I do think that as far as, like you were saying, people who are more skewed in one direction or the other, be it technique or sort of innate musicianship, I think that is true. You kind of have one or the other. If you're lucky, you have both. But I think what's fascinating, and I think the important work that comes once you identify that, is finding the balance between the two. Because once you do that, I think that's when you become sort of on that other level. But I think both are worth addressing and are important. And I think they both have their place.
I can't, the phrase I always say, and it's incredibly cheesy, but I always share it with all my students, is you are all beautiful snowflakes. And they groan, and they should groan. But as I say to them, you are all incredibly different, so don't expect everything to work for you. So I think about the development of talent. And I was fortunate to grow up in a somewhat unique household where I had a father who, as I mentioned, was in the Pittsburgh Symphony, second flute, very happy being second flute. I had a mother who would go on to become a very successful opera singer. Very, very different way of expressing oneself. And so for my father, it was sitting there and saying, you're going to play this cello, which I did, and you're going to learn the technical aspects of things. And that was undeniably important, essential. And my mother is sitting there going, I want you to listen to some Beatles and some Janis Joplin, and this is Maria Callas, and I want you to understand how to really express yourself. Depending on what environment you grow up in, has a massive effect on how you understand whatever you're going to be creating, whether it's technical or whether it is meant to be more on the musical expressive side. Is passion important to this? Absolutely, but what are you passionate about? Are you passionate about going towards an audience that's 18 to 24? Are you passionate about making a piece of music? Are you passionate about having to express yourself, or passionate about the applause that you end up getting at the end of a performance? And that all makes a huge difference too into what you create, how you create it, and what the outcome is for everyone involved.
I was really interested in what you said about this notion of different ways of connecting to the world, that there's a correlate or something that just feels inherently logical, that feels like a representative of the truth because of its, I'm paraphrasing what you're saying. But to me, I think that is something that I wouldn't have identified it that way, but there's a way of connecting to the world through music that felt very authentic, and it's the way to do it. It's the way to actually understand the world or connect to the world. There is this notion of the arts as an escape from reality, but this is what I was talking about, what I was trying to get to, what you were saying, Marty, is that it's a way of connecting to the world that feels just the most truthful way of connecting to the world, and that's something that was sort of motivating me, I think, all the way through, despite the real challenges.
For me, the concert hall is very much a space where it's a shared experience, where the musicians are uniting in a message from the past, where we are in the present, and the audience is hearing what that message is and interpreting it how they wish, how their identity with it is their own connection. But there's also something so similar to what many people experience in their religious communities, that we're all focused on the same thing and even facing each other in that communal experience. And I think there's a really deep source of meaning that I'm enjoying exploring this year in my own studies. But I think that there's something we can tap into in that shared communal experience of the concert hall and what that means to each of us.
Particularly in the digital world where there's been so much movement towards digital concert. You can get the Berlin Philharmonic online now and other these orchestras, but it's not the same thing. I know when I'm working with folks, because of the distances between with the composers I'm working with sometimes, FaceTime and Skype just does not get it done. You have to be in the same room, just talking to them. There's something about the way in which it changes the dynamic, and it is. You're right. It is. I completely agree with you that there's something, spiritual. There's something that has a contagious. Right. My experience has been there's this sort of ineffable connection that takes place when you're in a room with someone that is very hard to create without it. And also that's because there's a lot of creativity. We talk about how to foster creative moments, happen over meals, happen over while you're talking about something else, and all of a sudden there's a sort of an unexpected surprise moment where there's some sort of magnetic resonance that triggers something and an idea emerges. And in order to be there, you have to be receptive to it, and you have to be there. You have to show up for it. I find, yes, once a project is well underway, then we can send drafts back and forth to each other, and I can tell the composer this, and they can write back no, and I can tell them this, and they say no, whatever. But that's part of the dance of it all. But actually, the dance of it all, that's a happy accident that I said that, because that's what it's like. It's like a dance. And that there's there's almost like a physical component to it that's beyond the language that you're talking about, just being in the same room.
When you think about the greatest performances that you've been a part of, what have been the elements, conductor and otherwise, that stand out for you?
When I personally lose myself and I'm not thinking about intonation or my own idiosyncratic things I might be working on, or my stand partners this week, we had fun with our Mozart. When I'm not concerned about anything regarding the nitty-gritty human sort of details of partnership, or somebody smells bad or something, it's just we're lost completely in the music. Aside from being completely humbled that like an 8-year-old wrote this symphony, right? So there's so much of that inspiration and humility in that experience for me too. And I lose, when I'm not thinking about the technical aspects of it, is when the artistic heights, I think, are really transcendent and awe for audience and musician alike.
Individual musicians who maybe have a solo line will suddenly do something even more fantastic than they've ever done before, which causes you to respond in a similar way. And that's the kind of magic that happens at that moment. And I have to say, when those performances are going on, I lose all sense of time. Like, we'll be playing a piece that's 55 minutes, and I'm like, oh my God, it's almost over. We're at the end of Ein Heldenlied or something, and I'm like, how could this be ending? I don't want this to end, some really long piece that we're playing, the Messiaen Turangarila Symphony or something. And oh my gosh, we're done. How could that be?
There's something positive rather than negative happening. Choices are being made towards what to do rather than what not to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that sort of feeds on itself. I know when I'm working, since I've worked as an actor a lot before I do what I do, now, when you break down things into Stanislavski technique, you're creating in each moment. You're breaking down a scene into actions. You're not trying to play like happy or sad or something. You're trying to break it down to bit by bit and building it and making choices. And I always say what I'm trying to do is create characters making choices. The trajectory of their lives are changed based on the choices that they make, one after another, after another, after another. And that's when I'm, sort of crafting what I'm doing. And I think that's sort of what happens when you craft a beautiful musical experience. That it's let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, rather than let's not do this, let's not do that. And so it is almost like this. It is almost like the musical correlate for flow.
Psychology has a long tradition of telling people how not to get things wrong. In some ways, it's the pathological tradition. But it turns out not getting it wrong bears almost no relationship to getting it right. And it's a very different process. Right. And we know much more about not getting it wrong. And part of the reason Scott and I are doing this is the question, what is it to get something right?
I'm just thinking now of my music teachers who gave me so much because they looked at what I was doing right. And the bad ones only looked at what I was doing wrong. And I think that can happen with music teachers. But I was inspired by the ones who found great things in what I was doing.
Whether you're creating something in an orchestra or in an opera or writing for someone, you have you're all dependent on each other to make this thing happen. And I feel like once people realize that, it becomes a much more inspiring thing because they know to be inspired by each other. Because that's the only way you're going to get through it is if you. It's again, I really think the positive sort of psychology to it is extremely helpful, and it comes from that understanding of a beautiful dependence, not dependence in a bad way by any means, but in a really wonderful, inspiring way. It's creating something larger than yourself, especially in those scenarios, because it goes beyond you.
You know, this is what we try in the youth orchestras to do, to impart this sense of responsibility and how we're all reliant on each other, and we're only going to be as good as, you know, whatever the least amount of work somebody puts into it. We're trying to inspire them to learn to work to their utmost so that when they get together, they learn how they can trust each other to be dependent. And I think this is so important because not all of these people are going to end up being musicians, but they're learning about how this process of doing your part and learning to trust other people can lead to great creativity. And these are people that do amazing things out in the world.
There's always striving. I'm never good enough. The music is never what the composer had in mind because we always are trying more and more. If we're ever satisfied with it, I'm not doing my job. However, in the pure experiential part of it, in the performance experience, flow certainly happens. Optimal experience certainly happens. Like all of these psychological phenomena we experience daily, almost every concert for me. So I see both of those. One in the artistic striving, like life search. You know, Pablo Casal's quote from, just quoting him all over the place, aren't I? But in 93, I still practice 4 hours a day because I'm starting to sense some improvement. Right? So like put me in my grave the day I stop challenging myself and pushing myself as an artist, right? But then there's the experiential side of it, which we experience. So that's how the transcendence resonates with me.
I'm thinking of a quote about Bach's music, that it's great because it's inevitable yet surprising. And that's kind of what I want to feel. It's what I want to create and feel and think about in music.
You can't be free to get to this transcendent place unless you have, you know, woodshed like a crazy person at some point in your life, for, as you say, 93, your whole life. But you can't go to the piano and do this. You have to play, and you have to practice, and you have to want it and discipline yourself. And then freedom is a byproduct.
It's the reward.
It's the reward that you can do anything because you have these incredible skills.
What fascinates me is no matter how many times I watch Yo-Yo Ma perform the Elgar Cello Concerto, he looks like as though he's feeling the same level of transcendence. No matter how many, he must have performed it over 250 times, I don't know.
But I think the key there is that he's performing it for the first time in each one.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And
The more you perform it, the more you hear other possibilities.
Well, I like that.
So then the next time I go out, I'm going to go for this because I felt that I almost got that and it opened up another door to my thoughts.
I think the secret to transcendence is always raising the bar. It's also the secret, I think, to flow. Always raise the level of challenge, and because the excitement and the inspiration of rising to it is so powerful.
That's what Yumi said with the challenge being.
Yeah, I'd have to say that when it changes you, whatever it is, as a listener or as a performer, when the transcendence or in flow, but when music, it changes you.
Could you narrate specific performances that things you've been in which you've been in the presence of the transcendent?
For me, when we used to play Dvorak 9, the Adagio, and my grandmother had died, I would actually get teary-eyed on stage because I knew she was listening. Like I was playing that for her, and it sort of it connected me to her, and you get goosebumps, and I was crying. And I hope it was. I mean, I don't care what the audience was singing, but that's what was going on for me. And the first part of it, I don't even play. When the cellos are in rest, listening to the beautiful English horn solo, and I just knew Grammy was listening. And I don't know if that's something that happens for an audience member too. They're transcending what's there into something else. But that was a very spiritual experience for me. A total opposite will be like after Mozart Jupiter, like this, I can't go to sleep for like 2 hours after a concert because you're on a complete emotional high. And often if I could run a marathon at like 10 p.m., I would, because I have so much energy after these amazing concerts. There's just exhilarating, they're natural highs. They're the similar experiences that in reading research from this past fall, many of the researchers show that that's the same chemical reactions going on inside. So there are some very contrasting experiences that I've had from being on stage in very different musical atmospheres.
I think one's mind is frequently cluttered with all different kind of conflicting thoughts and imaginings and concerns. And I think a transcendent moment, and I'm thinking of two in specific, two moments in music that mean an enormous amount to me. And when I hear them, I don't play them, but when I hear them, I feel like the only thing I can think about is what I'm hearing was the delayed entrance in Dona nobis pacem in the B minor Mass. When that hits, when that pedal hits, and you hear that entrance, I can't think about anything in the world except that being alive right here, right now. And in the second act finale in The Marriage of Figaro, da 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 da, just like it's just. And then Mozart was smart enough to repeat it because he knew it had to do it again. And I always said that's the golden mean of Western civilization. You could figure out when the world's going to end if you figure out where it began, and that's it. You could figure it all out because it's so incredibly divine. But I think for me with transcendence, one of the aspects of transcendence is that it declutters your mind. It focuses your mind on just what's in front of you. And it becomes, like I said earlier about now, that's what we're all yearning for. And when that delayed entrance comes into the B minor Mass, there is nothing but it, right here, right now. I'm alive listening to this, and I'm not thinking about all the other concerns. And then of course, they reemerge. But then, to me, that's a transcendent moment.
It seems to me that it's like the ultimate sensation of completely letting go and yet being completely in the moment. Like I remember the last time I felt this was the last opera we did, The Rape of Lucretia, the beginning, the woman trio. It's this like beautiful picture of domesticity coming right out of this like really jarring toxic masculinity sort of militaristic scene. And it's like this out of body experience where you just feel completely like you're vibrating. But you're not in your own head, and yet you're still doing everything. It's like something is flowing through you. That's just not something you get to feel. And it's still completely just there. It's truly, time collapsing, and there's nothing but that thing. And like I just remember feeling completely connected to everyone else too, which was important because I think another thing, at least for me, whenever I feel this sort of transcendence, even if it's in a solo recital, I'm still with the pianist, and that sort of connection flowing through everything and not just myself is what I usually feel. I kind of like feel this like vibration. It's really cool.
It's different than an adrenaline high.
Yes.
I feel like I'm floating when I'm doing that, when I get that sensation. It's very different than that just intensity of an adrenaline high.
I'm thinking about this transcendent experience. Is it possible to have a without human worldview where everything is natural? There's some basics, there absolutely are, but the experiences that we all bring to the table, to our listening table, are massive. So I can understand how some people are going to be overwhelmed by Drake, the rapper, right? That's their experience. right? My best friend is a photographer. He shoots all the Jay-Z album covers and all those guys. And so that crowd he hangs out in, they have transcendent experiences. When John has one picture of shooting Biggie in Brooklyn, and you see the faces. It's an amazing, iconic photograph. He's standing on stage, and there's Biggie before he was shot. It's 93, 94, and you see the faces out there, and they're just somewhere else. So the transcendent experience, versus authenticity. I don't know if one can have a transcendent experience without it being authentic. And so I don't know how I'd have to think more about the relationship, but I don't know if you can have transcendent without authentic. You can have authentic without transcendent, right? But you can't have transcendent without authentic, and that I don't think. And that back to the faking with conductors, you can't fake it. Lewis Hyde, in one of my favorite books, a book called The Gift, about the relationship between commerce and creativity, or art and commerce. He starts off the whole book by saying every single, this is the opening line, every single Harlequin romance novel, no one kisses until between 89 and 91, right? Something else doesn't happen until page 110. Nothing ever, this doesn't happen until page 143. Why don't they move us? They don't move us because they're not authentic. They move us because they're formulaic, right? And so once you get the technique down, the ability to then just speak that voice, to use your voice, whether it is Bonnard, whether it is Bach, whether it is Biggie, to use that voice, irrespective of who's going to be listening or who's going to be performing, that seems to be absolutely essential.
I do think that the transcendent moments are moments. This is in which one loses one's ego. Mm-hmm. That is, because that is, in the end, you have to have incredible technique with people to accomplish it, or listening to people with incredible technique. You have to have this. There's so many things that you have to stipulate, but in the end, that is the common denominator, and it's something where you're identifying yourself not with the waves but with the water. You're part of the whole, not this individual manifestation, but there's something that is large and small simultaneously. That's you feel like you're connected to. It's a very large thing, and yet it feels like it can sit in the palm of your hand. There's this cross, these beautiful cross currents. But in the end, it's about feeling essentially human and not essentially Gene. That is the moment where a transcendent experience takes place. And music is just such an incredible way of getting there because of its lack of specificity. It's both incredibly specific but incredibly abstract, and I think that's maybe the strongest beeline, maybe dance, to just feeling completely yourself and beyond yourself. I don't know.
Yumi was talking about playing Dvorak and remembering her grandmother. I have the same experience with certain pieces of music that I associate with certain people. And maybe something that they've said or something that they requested to be played at their funeral or whatever. And every time those movements are played, I just feel a connection. I'm having the transcendent moment just from the level of the experience of the playing, but I'm also having a transcendent moment because I feel like I'm connecting with people who are elsewhere, who are no longer here.
There's an old distinction which Danny Kahneman has made popular recently between System 1 and System 2. So System 1 is intuitive, effortless, imagistic, non-draining, and System 2 is deliberation, rationality, thinking something through. So what I took away from the physics meeting was that imagination occurs in System 1. And then it gets elaborated in System 2. And Scott and I were talking about that in music. And I just had the naive, a tune occurring to you, a phrase, and that occurs in System 1. And then
gets processed.
Yeah, so that's the leading question in some ways, and I don't know if it's useful at all. I alluded before to the difference between not getting it wrong and getting it right. And I think about this a lot in teaching as well. I mean, what I want my students to do is get it right. And I often wind up as a teacher teaching about not getting it wrong. But I wonder if not getting it wrong is in System 2. But getting it right might be in System 1. So again, leading or misleading.
System 1, it feels like we're not judging that which is being created. System 2 is more analytical, so we're looking at it and exploring it, investigating it.
Well, I think it's important to stay in System 1 for quite a long time, because without that, you might not have anything. And suspend criticism, suspend all sort of intellectual analysis until you have something.
Yeah, System 1, I would think, would be your more being idealistic about what could be possible. Well, how wouldn't this be great? I have this great idea, and just going with that for a while to see how much you can expand that idea. And then System 2 would be the process of, well, what can I do to get there? And then how much of System 1 can I actually accomplish?
I think perfectionism is System 2. Mm-hmm. And I think you have to suspend perfectionism to ever get to System 2, because you will get nothing on paper, so to speak, if you live in a state of perfectionism all the time.
That's why I wonder about the idea of imagination, and as one becomes more increasingly masterful in a domain, in this domain music, if we don't begin to live more of our life in System 1 rather than System 2, because we're auto-critiquing, right?
That makes a lot of sense.
It's almost, you can train yourself to remove the roadblocks in System 1 so that you can live there longer, and that you can create from there. I think that's probably what if you're doing a yogi can get into this state. And I think there's probably ways of doing it, and we don't, because there are things now which I would call intuition, or maybe just learned from experience. There are mistakes. I make many mistakes, but there are mistakes that I don't make in lyric writing that I used to make because I've learned how to do it, or in the creative process.
I think also what Jean, you were saying about the discipline and the technique. So it seems to me that also, if the more discipline and technique one has from a System 2, the greater the possibilities of System 1.
Are there specific components of imagination in music? And I'm not just talking about how teaching great musicians. Like, let's focus really on when you think of imaginative, creative musicians. What are those components, and what could you do to actually improve them, increase them in a training program?
I think music as an art form is in the process of reinventing itself to its audience. And I think that the traditional audience that most classical musicians have always thought of is an audience that still exists, but I think that if music is going to create a growth opportunity for itself, that it's not about so much what we're doing within the art form, but to, who's listening to it. So we've spent a lot of time here, and I know so many arts organizations are spending so much time thinking about how can we better engage communities and people that we have not in the past. And it's in the world of grants, it is an enormous part of where people are looking for progress. One of the most popular classes now is improvisation at Curtis. And we offer it once a year, every fall semester, and I find it interesting because so much of the work that every young person before they get here has gone through has been very, let's say, System 2 oriented. It's all about getting to the point where you don't have to think about what you're doing as you're playing. And the improvisation course is you can't get much more System 1. I mean, it's about completely letting go and kind of engaging with your imagination, with your creativity.
If more people had these improvisatory skills, you would be able to go into any situation and take these, basic percussion instruments and just start with this basic feeling. Play what you feel, or play what you think the weather is today, or play what color you like the best. And, start a conversation, a musical conversation that sparks people's creativity. And it's a very low-cost outreach project, really.
Okay, someone gave me $4 million or millions and millions of dollars, and how would I spend it? This might be counterintuitive, but I would spend it on the teachers. I would. There's this desire, and understandably, we need to get more instruments. First of all, I believe in public education and trying to, enhance that. Was where I got my musical beginnings, was public school. But it seems to me that my brother and sister-in-law, she's a education professor at Smith, and they wrote a book called The Teacher-Centric School, basically arguing for where the money should be going is into enhancing the ego, the sense of purpose and resources that are given to public school teachers. One of my other thought was two other things. I love the idea of singing. That's a great idea. I really think people who, if people would sing together, it would change the world. And a competition where a whole school that has to sing together, or something like that, something silly like that. But seriously, I think that's the other thing I would say is, because of storytelling being sort of the focus of my world, I think it would help enormously if somehow school kids and communities could have stories from their communities. I know this is happening, but to the extent to which it could be supported. Because if you start the process, all of a sudden you have to play the instruments, you have to do all of the extra hard skills and the stuff that's part of the accomplishment thing of your PERMA that would help. I would create, I'm riffing here, I would create programs in which their performances from the schools, they can come together. They do this now, but it's funded, where they can come together and show their concerts, and all of the professionals that are professional music teachers that do this get extra money. There's some way of incentivizing participation in this, or money for music teachers to go to concerts or something like that, or some connections. Well, how about local music teachers getting to go to the Philadelphia Orchestra for free or something like that? I don't know, but there's some way in which it's, because there is something not just about the the nuts and bolts of it. It's a feeling. It's that feeling of being special and feeling that you're valued.
Music teachers feel kind of threatened anyway, because it's sometimes the first program they cut when they make cost cuts, because it's kind of expensive. And with this emphasis on STEM, it doesn't play into that at all. In fact, all the arts are the first to go, because they don't seem to have concrete outcomes in money making and that sort of thing.
I think that's one of the things about the Elsa Stamen-inspired programs is changing the way that music is thought of. I mean, for the kids who are doing Tune-Up Philly or who are doing Play on Philly, the program isn't about making them excellent at music. I mean, it's about the results of being active in that way, and the skills and experiences that are built through music, but not necessarily the musical skills. I mean, that's kind of something else that happens, but I don't think that's the main
really
function
great.
of the program.
My first lesson, I love my teacher that I'm studying with. I've loved all of my teachers. So the first lesson I had with her, the reason the planets sort of aligned and I knew I wanted to be with her, was because she opened the lesson asking me, what are 3 things you like about your voice? Which, 1, already positive. 2, is immediately looking inward at myself, because we all become our own teachers to a certain extent. That's the end goal. They give you the tools for your toolbox, is ideally the relationship you have. And 3, it started a dialogue that was just
Positive.
very positive.
If you can give advice to, one piece of advice to an aspiring musician or composer, what would it be?
Find great mentors, because that's what gets you through. And great teachers and mentors, but someone who you can turn to will give you support as you go through the process, which is not always so easy.
Well, one piece of advice I give my students who say that they really want to go into music is I always have consultations with the families, and because most of my kids at this point are high school students, and I just make no bones about it's not a clear path. You know, if you go to medical school, you go to law school, you know, you're going to be able to graduate, and you know what the starting salaries are, and you know what your likelihood of finding a job is. This is definitely not a clear path, and I only recommend it. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's for the people who can't live without it. You have to say, this is just part of why I get up every day. This is part of who I am. This is just so much a part of my identity. I cannot see myself doing anything else.
You have to be truly, truly dedicated to see it
Absolutely.
through.
And even then, there are no assurances.
And also, I consider asking the question of how does what you do make the world a better place, or connect you to other people? Because when we talk about meaning and connection, I think too often, again, you can vouch this more closely than I can, often musicians will lose their way in a really competitive place. Say, I am here to win. I am here to be the best. I'm here to be the soloist or be the first chair, as opposed to I'm here because, for me, connection with other people is about music. And to keep on focus in that regard, it can be a really challenging thing to do in a conservatory environment. But to consistently ask that question and have conversations about that, I would imagine would help people not only be more fulfilled, they'd be more engaged because they're connecting in a certain way and hit flow more often. They'd have a touchstone consistently, but they'd also be able to be. I imagine it would also diminish stress to a certain extent and allow them to be more creative and imaginative because they don't feel I have to be the best. They have to feel I'm pursuing something to connect to the world, and that's a very, very different way of pursuing any creative pursuit, but certainly music. So why are you here, and how does it help connect you to the rest of the world?